Hey there! I hope you heard of NOOREVER. If not, it is a tiny step that hopes to describe the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's inspiring character, his fully dedicated life, and his endless love for humanity as much as the tongue can afford.
The NOOREVER Youth prepares youth projects like
Sunnah and Science. We research the habits of our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and reveal the scientific aspects in his Sunnah.
Live streams, featuring experts on the various aspects of the Prophet's life, answering questions and delivering informative talks.
Jewelry for the jewels. We design jewelry based on the life stories and the lessons that we learn from our jewels, who are the female Sahaba.
Islamic holiday videos to build excitement and appreciation for our holidays, especially in non-Muslim majority countries.
Poems. Through the beauty of poetry, we get reminded of our dear Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
And Noontime Stories, where we tell the wonderful stories of our Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his companions.
If you're young or feeling young and would like to be part of this endeavor, here's what you can do.
Content creation, research, editing, captioning, translating.
Different language, same heart. Ayrı dil, aynı gönül.
Music, voiceovers, animation, graphic design, coding, and social media.
If you would like to be a part of NOOREVER, don't forget to fill out our interest form.
Hi everyone, welcome to NOOREVER and welcome back NOOREVER family. This program is led by youth from all over the world and it hopes to show the endless love and passion Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has for humanity and the impact he has on us as a youth. If you would like to be a part of this project, you can reach out to us on our social media platforms. So today we have a very special guest, Professor Soltes. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Ori Soltes. I teach at Georgetown. Theology, art history, philosophy, politics, a lot of interdisciplinary stuff, and a lot of material that focuses on the interface among Judaism, Christianity, Islam, as well as a strong particular interest in the Hizmet movement inspired by Fethullah Gulen, about whom I've written a couple of books now and a bunch of articles. So that's who I am in a nutshell.
It's great to hear from you and it's great to have you here. So I'm personally also really interested in the major that you just mentioned. And I'm really excited to interview you today and ask you a couple questions about those things. Sure. So the first question is, why did you decide to choose the topic of the images of the Prophet to give your message? With which mindset should we be interacting with today's topic before we even start?
Right. Because my message is always about two things, really. One, which is that every religious tradition is built on two kinds of foundations. The first is revelation. So every tradition starts with some text that it believes is revealed by God. And then at a certain point, the period of revelation is understood to have ended. And then we're caught for the rest of the history of that religion in the issue and the problem of interpretation. And when we look, for example, at the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the first point of interpretation is what constitutes the revelation. But even once we agree, okay, this is what is the revelation, that's not. Let's just assume we agree on that. Within a particular tradition that embraces one revelation, there are going to be varied interpretations, particularly as and when and if these faiths spread. And of course, all three of them are all over the planet. So it stands to reason that in different times and places, there have been different understandings of all kinds of aspects of how God wants us to be. And because there has been a particularly rich number of controversies in the last 2 decades or so regarding the notion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, and whether or not he can even be portrayed, I thought it would be interesting to look at some images that demonstrate that there are times and places where clearly it was not uncomfortable for people to present him visually in figurative terms, just as we can assume that there are plenty of times and places where people would be uncomfortable, but no one has the franchise on what is correct. What I believe is what I believe because I believe it. And what you believe is what you believe because you believe it. And neither of us is going to convince the other, I'm right, you're wrong, you're right, I'm wrong. Which means that ultimately what we want to be about, and that's why this is relevant to youth and not to youth, it's relevant to people, that I can have an absolute conviction about the truth of my understanding of God and everything that pertains to that, that works for me. And that does not need to contradict my complete embrace and acceptance and respect for your perspective, even though they're different perspectives, because yours works for you in a way that it doesn't work for me, just as mine works for me in a way that it doesn't work for you. And as long as we understand that it's ultimately about a reality that we understand through belief and not through being able to concretely point it out, as long as we understand that my sense that it's only my way is my ego speaking and not God speaking, then we have the possibility for all kinds of beauty within the world that has flourished from time to time and place to place, and alas, not always. So that's the long-winded answer to your brief question. That's why I chose this topic today in particular. And of course, because I love visual art.
You cut off for a second. Sorry about that.
You're and now you cut off. You're muted according to what I'm seeing on the screen. It's anti-witness, cut you out.
No, but your words are actually so beautiful. I love that perspective because that's one thing that people struggle to understand a lot, that we can have views and share them and be content with them without, disrespecting other people's beliefs and views. And
Exactly.
valuing those things is really important, and which is why I really am like excited to talk to you today. And we see an image over here.
Yes.
Would you want to
So
talk
yes, shall I? So I chose to start with an image, which is actually a detail from a mosaic floor of a synagogue in the Galilee in northern Israel. Northern Israel at Bet Alpha, done around 525. So to put it in context, about 2 generations before the prophet was born. And what you see here is a representation of the understanding in Genesis 22 of Abraham's being told by God to offer Isaac and agreeing to do so. So what you actually see is a rather rudimentary figure of Abraham. This is Isaac, and we actually have their names in Hebrew, Abraham, Isaac. We've got the 2 young men who in Genesis 22 are waiting at the bottom of the mountain. We've got the altar. And interestingly, we've got, how do I represent God? Because in the Muslim and Jewish traditions, I can't represent God as I can easily in the Christian tradition, because in the Christian tradition, Jesus is God. So it's easy to represent him. So what the artist apparently did was give us a kind of hand. So he's taken the phrase, the hand of God, and he's kind of literalized it, reaching out of this kind of cloudburst. And then the words, send forth not thy hand, it's where God says, stop, don't do it. But my point is twofold here. One, forever and ever and ever, it was assumed that Jews never do figurative art. And here we see, it's rather rudimentary, figurative art. And I could show you scores and scores of other representations of important people like Abraham, depicted figuratively, not abstractly. So clearly it's not the case that in spite of how some people have read the second commandment, in the book of Exodus in the Bible, that seems to say don't make visual art or don't make figurative art, if you read it in context, it's don't make it for the purposes of worshiping it. It doesn't say don't make it. As a practical matter, over the course of history, many, many times and places, Jews have not wanted to make figurative art because they associate it with idolatry, but clearly not always. And second, in this case, we even have the artist trying to fall between the I can't figuratively, I can't visually represent the invisible God, and yet giving a concrete vision. So I'm using this as a backdrop for turning to the precise question within Islam and its history and geography regarding the idea of whether the Prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, can be represented at all. Because as you know, if you looked across the Muslim world today and asked most Muslims, at least a good number of them would not only say, no, you may not. And there are others who would even say, well, it's a sin to do so. And what I'm telling you is that may be true here or there, but not always. So, for example, this is an illuminated manuscript, and there are 3 different areas of the Muslim world which have long histories of manuscript illuminations. Ottoman Turkey, Timurid and Safavid Persia, and Mughal India. This is an image that's from about 1594. It's from the Book of the Prophet, the Siyar-i-Nabi, and it's called Court Style. And it was commissioned by the Sultan Murad III, an Ottoman Sultan, and probably the artist is Mustafa al-Darir. And what we're seeing is an image of Muhammad together with Abu Bakr and Ali on the way to Mecca. So I call your attention to 4 things here. 1, there is an attempt to give us a kind of sense of landscape, even though the sky is pure gold leaf, so it's kind of a spaceless space, but the sense of mountains, of ground line, of trees. 2, that we've got Abu Bakr and Ali together, so this is obviously in defiance of the notion of a kind of Sunni Shi'i split between we really focus only on Abu Bakr, we only focus on Ali. No, obviously they were together. The one was the Prophet's father-in-law, the other was his nephew and son-in-law. They were all together. It is we who created a division after the death of the Prophet and not they. 3rd, the Prophet himself is in fact shown with this wonderful, soaring, towering halo, which suggests his connection to God that separates him from others. This idea in the Christian visual tradition becomes, as you probably know, this round kind of golden plate that saints and other kinds of people will have behind their heads. Typically in the Muslim style, it's this soaring flame. And finally, of course, his face is covered up so that we won't see him. So we're thinking, okay, the artist has shown the Prophet, but not shown him. But you see, elsewhere, we actually see his face. This is a detail from a manuscript that comes from the Persian Timurid period, so somewhere in the early 15th century. And what you're seeing is, again, that particular style of the flaming halo. Again, we see the Prophet gesturing, seated on the back of, and it's, of course, the talking steed Burak, who is part of the hadith that describes or that elaborates on what we get in the first ayat, the first verse of Surah 17 of the Quran, which is called the Isra. It's this night journey that Hadith understands, takes the Prophet in a single night from Mecca to Al-Quds, the sacred Jerusalem, up to heaven, that's the Miraj, and back to Mecca. And not only do the Hadiths go on and on and on, elaborating in all kinds of details about his experiences, but it turns out we have a very rich visual tradition of it. So this is one detail of him, and I'm moving on to my next image. Look carefully, it's not the same. It's very similar. Burak looks virtually the same. The Prophet looks very similar, but you'll notice his hands here are inside and not outside his garment. And you'll notice here that the halo carries from his waist up rather than from the shoulders up. So we have different variations on this happens, and now we're seeing more of the scene. So he's led in the Miraj from the rock, which is marked today by the monument called the Dome of the Rock, as you know, up to heaven, led by the angel Jibril, or in English we call him Gabriel, and the angel has these weird wings. you'll also notice he doesn't really have feet. His legs kind of disappear into this kind of abstraction. And on his way up, the Hadith says, he meets and is greeted by and cheered on by a series of prior prophets. And we see some of them here, so that we see Enoch, we see Abraham, we see Moses, or Enoch, we see Ibrahim, we see Musa, we see Jesus, Isa, as part of the crew that he sees on the way up. I'm going to show you another one. As you can see, a slightly different style. His hands are different. We see Burak, we see Jibreel again. And this is the most amazing image to me of all. Because where is he now? He's at the peak of his journey, and he's having an audience with God. How do I depict God who cannot be depicted, who is invisible? We saw one answer to that question, which I began with, in the Bet Alpha mosaic, by just showing this hand sticking out of a cloudburst. This artist, it's an anonymous artist. This is from one of the, it's a book that's called the Mirajnameh, and it dates from about 1436. Again, it's Timurid. It was the Shah Rukh who commissioned it. It was made in Herat, which is in what is now Afghanistan. Then it was part of the Persian Empire. This actually, now you'll find it if you want to look for it, in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, in Paris. But this anonymous artist has shown the God whose face we cannot see by trying to give us a kind of infinite number of faces, because there's too many to count. I mean, obviously you can count these if you stop, but at first glance, it's like, boom, you're just overwhelmed by all of these faces so that you're seeing no face at all. It would be much simpler, you know, to look at one face. To see all of these faces is going over the edge to suggest facelessness. And let me show you yet one more image. This is again the prophet Muhammad with other prophets. He is leading the prayers with a series of others. We have Ibrahim, we have Musa, we have Isa, and we have other prophets. I suspect one of them is Enoch. I'm not sure, probably Yusuf is probably the fifth that we see here. And the two things to which I call your attention are, one, conceptually speaking, where is this taking place? It can only be on the path up to heaven, because that's the context in which the prophet would see the prior prophets. So this is another artist's conception. It looks like the interior of a mosque, does it not? And you can recognize the style. It's a very Safavid style decor of the tiles and all. So that's the kind of setting that we have to infer. And secondly, he is the prophet of prophets. He's the seal of prophets. So all of these whom he respects and who respect him precede him, but lead up to him. And that's signified by the artist, it seems to me, by the fact that all of them have these halos, but they all extend from the shoulders. And only Muhammad, peace be unto him, is shown with a halo that covers his entire body. What if it were shaped in an almond shaped, in the Christian tradition would be called a nimbus or a mandala, and it would be shaped almond-like. But in the Muslim tradition, we have these soaring gold flames. So again and again, in different times and places, we see actual portraits of the prophet with his face, not even hiding his face, but with his face, so clearly across the history of Islam and its vast geography. There are times and places where there was no discomfort in representing the prophet. Let me show you one last image. And this is actually contemporary. This was done about 1995. It's by a Muslim scribe, a friend of mine. His name is Mohammed Zachariah. He was actually born in Portland, Oregon as a Christian. He was a motorcycle fiend. He's got tattoos still all over his arms from his motorcycle days. In his 30s, he found Islam and he became a Muslim. And he became so intense about his studies of Islam that he learned Arabic well enough so that I was visiting him in his studio one day and he had a letter from someone from Jordan and he was laughing at the grammar errors because his Arabic was that much better than the native speaker who wrote to him. But more to the point, he decided to study calligraphy, to become a hettat. And at the time, when I met him in the early 90s, he was the only person who was trained, and certainly the only Westerner, who had been trained both in Istanbul and in Morocco in two different styles of calligraphy. So he was, so to speak, a double hatat. There may be others now. And this is one of the many works that he has done that are, as you can see, extremely beautiful. I'm going to zoom to fit. It will blur a little bit, but that's okay. He does the whole thing, all of the decorative elements around it. And you can see Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim as the opening of what is a pair of different descriptions of the Prophet. So this is, of course, a completely other direction that Islam has taken. Verbal portraits of the Prophet, and as you know, it's called a hilya. So this is a hilya. It's a verbal portrait of the Prophet, and there are different ones over the course of time and space that, in a sense, you might say, compete with each other as to who can more effectively represent the Prophet in words. And here is someone in the modern era who, rather than going in the kind of direction represented by those figurative images that I just showed you, is very traditional in his approach to Islamic visual art. He deals exclusively in magnificent forms of calligraphy, including but not limited to this hilya. I'm going to stop share because we don't need this any longer. Well, should I keep it up in case anyone has questions that I want to go back on? Or you?
I actually have a question. So where was the previous picture from? Where's the artist from for that picture? Because I noticed the pattern there.
Yeah, this one is almost certainly from a Safavid artist in Persia, probably 16th century. So by the way, we are also in these images, you know, the first one I showed you was obviously Sunni in terms of the background of the artist. This one is Shi'i. And the one before it was Sunni because from the Timurid to the Safavid period, Persia changed from having a kind of mixed identity, as much Sunni as Shi'i. And when we get to the Safavids, it becomes a specifically Shi'i kind of, Shi'i Islam becomes the governmental religion, just as, you know, Sunni will be more or less for the Ottomans, the government religion, and so on and so forth. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying because you have subsets of subsets.
So I was wondering, I see a pattern here because in some of the images, like I'm an artist, so I looked a little more closely, but I'm seeing a pattern of depicting people in a different way of different races. So people are depicted in more so like there's more monolith eyes in this picture. I'm seeing probably an artist who's from, because I know Persia at the time, there was a lot of Mongols in the area.
Absolutely. And you see that in these works again and again and again, the rounder faces, the narrow eyes. If I had time and if we were broadening our conversation, I could show you figurative, you're absolutely right, figurative imagery extending from India to, you know, to Istanbul. And you would see a wonderful diversity of faces. And of course, in some cases, there is an intended diversity of face to underscore the fact that Islam is universal. So it's not as if Muslims are accounted for by one race. They can be found all over the planet of all races. And so that's part of the purpose of the artist. Although I don't think in the cases of the ones that I've shown you here, that was the goal. I think it's, I mean, because these guys, I mean, each looks different from each other, but I would say they look pretty much like they come from the same sort of, I don't know, ethnicity, shall we say. The slight difference in color here, I think, is just the damage to the manuscript. But, you know, there's a slightly redder face, slightly whiter face. But part of that is these are different individuals from different time periods as well, you know. And clearly the artist is sensitive to these kinds of nuances. So thank you for picking up on that.
Of course. And I was wondering, I want to stay on this a little bit more, but I don't think we have time for it because we have more questions.
Sure.
So I want to go on to the Hilyas. I know you talked about it a little bit, but I was wondering, how were they written and what different sources were used to make them? Because I know you talked about that specific one, but generally speaking.
Right. So the one that Muhammad Zakaria had put together were two different portraits, actually, from two different sources in Hadith. But you end up, of course, over the course of time, not only with different bodies of hadith, and you know there are not only different groups of hadiths that are agglomerated together in different times and places, and you also know that there are some hadiths that are considered stronger than others. Those that have a line of transmission that goes all the way back to the time of the Prophet and his associates, those that go back, but there's a missing link, those that don't go as far back, and so on. But also, there's some that Sunni Muslims accept that Shi'i don't, and vice versa. But you then have further subsets because you have different madhabs, right? Different schools of Sharia in these different traditions. And I mean, all kinds of subsets that non-Muslims are not aware of that exist across the wide Muslim world, that for a Jewish or a Christian audience is easiest to understand by thinking comparatively of Christianity, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy that develops in different directions, the Protestant denominations, of which, for example, in the United States, there are 300 denominations alone. So it shouldn't be a surprise that in Islam you have Alevis, who are not Shi'i, they're Sunni, but in many respects they're closer to Shi'i than they are Sunni. And you find them in Turkey, but you don't find them in Afghanistan, that sort of thing. So you also have added material that has been created by subsequent poet-scholars across the Islamic world, added to material that has been gleaned out of the different hadiths that pertain to different aspects of the Prophet in describing him. So, of course, it's not just visual description, it's not just intellectual description, it's spiritual description, it's emotional description. It's extracts, that come out of hadith, that something that he said to someone that gives us an insight into the kind of individual he was, that can also form part of a hilya. So in a way, it's wide open, depending on how clever and creative someone has been to derive from different sources the wherewithal to come up with a descriptive series of lines. I'd almost call them of verses that encapsulate the Prophet effectively, or encapsulate an aspect of what he was about effectively.
So I think we already answered this, but about the pictures again.
Yes.
So we know that, like we already talked about this, that it is not a sin, but it is considered very wrong to
right.
depict
For some, and not for all.
Yeah.
As that, and I started out with the Jewish example to present a kind of parallel there, because to this day there are plenty of Jews in different parts of the world who would be offended at any kind of figurative representation in general, and not just of Moses or something of that sort. And obviously there are Jews all over the world who are not at all uncomfortable with figurative representation. And if we look at that example of the Bet Alpha mosaic, and there are other examples from antiquity that I could have shown you, even trying to somehow get around not being able to represent God by showing the hand of God coming out of a starburst, or as in that incredible Miraj image, God has 99 names that you and I could know, but obviously, according to the tradition, the Prophet knew maybe 400, and a mystic has the hope of knowing several hundred. So that I have a feeling, obviously the artist is anonymous, so I can't even have interviewed him if I wanted to interview him, even if I could bring myself back to that time. I have the sense that he, and I'm assuming it's a he, it could have been a she, but probably a he, had this idea of all of these names of God. That's how we access the God who is so inaccessible in ordinary, everyday, five senses, intellect kind of terms, by coming up with all these identical faces so that I can't even focus on a face. It's as if they're stand-ins for the names, as the stand-ins, in a sense, as the names themselves are stand-ins for Allah itself. And again, we have a parallel between that and the Jewish tradition, except the Jewish tradition is not that there are all these different names, although there are. It's rather none of them actually is the name of God. Everyone is a kind of circumlocution when you say the word in Hebrew, that we translate into English as God or Lord, you actually are not reading the letters in Hebrew and sounding them out the way they would sound. You say something else. And if you're a traditional Jew and you're not in the midst of prayer, you won't even say that. You go even further. So instead of saying in Hebrew, it would be Yahava or something like that, because as in Arabic, there are no vowels. So exactly how it's supposed to be pronounced, we can't be sure. But let's just pretend we can. But that's not what you say. When you're reading a prayer or you're reading the Torah, the Taurat, and you see that, you say Adonai, which literally means my lords. It's pluralized, by the way. But if I'm speaking as I am now, and I'm a very traditional Jew, I won't even say that. Instead, I say Hashem, the name. So you've got these circumlocutionary ways of distancing yourself from actually believing that you're in touch with God itself, even though your goal, of course, is to be in touch with God itself. And we can translate that very effectively into Islam with that same sort of sensibility, but it's conveyed in a slightly different way. What exactly is the difference between Al-Rahman and Al-Rahim, or between those and Al-Haq, or between those and Allah? What's the difference among those words? And obviously there are differences. They're trying to get our heads around from all these different angles, something which we can't get our heads around. We can only get our hearts around it.
Yes, that was a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah, we can only get our hearts around it. I was like, for a second, I was thinking, it's like, there's so much going on. What is he gonna say? And you just put like the right perfect spot. I was like, okay, great. But yeah, that's beautiful. And like, it's really interesting to hear about those things. I wish we had more time. But is there anything else that you would like to mention before I move on to the next question?
No, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
So I was really fascinated by the books that you wrote. I looked them up a little bit, and like I see that like you wrote about many different topics. Is there any specific one that you would like to share with us about?
Yeah, well, there are two in particular. One is more accessible than the other. One is called Our Sacred Signs, and it's about symbols in the visual arts, in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And so I talk about symbolic, for example, the halo. I talk about that, and the word itself is a Greek word meaning sun. So it sun, of course. So it meant a sunburst, and it turns out that the idea that someone who has a proximity to divinity that the rest of us don't have, that the idea of somehow marking that individual with a kind of sunburst has a history that goes all the way back to the Sumerians, almost 5,000 years ago, in what is today Iraq. So it's not something that either the Christians invented and then the Muslims picked up from them, or the Jews invented and the Christians it had a long history, and then each tradition has kind of taken its own particular visual direction. So my point and purpose in the book is to show how these traditions share similar symbols, borrow from each other, reinterpret in accordance with their specific needs, but how so much of their symbolic vocabulary precedes all of them. So again, it's kind of an exercise in making us aware of how we are ultimately all so similar, and that notion of our similarity does not undercut the distinctness, how all of us as groups and each of us as individuals is unique. And the other book is on mysticism that I would point out, called Searching for Oneness, Mysticism in the Three Abrahamic Traditions. And again, my point is to share the whole issue, not only of revelation and interpretation, but how that is taken to an intense degree by those we call mystics, who have as their point and their purpose to really get on the innermost inside of God in a way that they feel everyday practitioners of religion don't. And so, I talk about Jewish mysticism, including but not limited to the phase that most people think of when they think of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah. I talk about the whole history of Christian mysticism from its earlier practitioners to contemporary people. I talk about Sufism and where and how it originates, and the evolution from a kind of awestruck sensibility to what Rabia introduces early on as love for and not awe for God, and how that plays out, and how all of the notion of being simultaneously what I am intensely and yet universalistically inclined is so beautifully expressed, in particular by Ibn Arabi, by Rumi, two very important 12th and 13th century Sufis, and so on. So those two books are, I think, of most interest for the kind of conversation we're having now.
I feel like mysticism really like excites a lot of people. I mean, it excites me a lot, but I know it excites a lot of the youth as well. And
Yes.
I'm trying to like I bought a lot of books from Turkey. I'm trying to read them, you know, but
Yes.
I'm definitely gonna look into your book as well because like as you explained, like I want to see the differences and the similarities between two. Is there an example that you could give that like could show the similarities between different religions and mysticisms?
Well, what I can do is, quote, for example, from Rumi, when he says, I go into a church, I go into a synagogue, I go into a mosque, I see one altar. And he has a number of different turns of phrase like that, as does Ibn Arabi, who in the end he says, my creed is love. Meet me there. As opposed to, he doesn't have to say my creed is Islam, because he knows and everybody knows that he's a Muslim, but he's trying to point out how much broader his embrace is. There's another book that I wrote on a contemporary Sufi and also an authority on Sufism. His name is Fethullah Gulen. And he lives in eastern Pennsylvania. Your audience, I imagine, is aware of him. He's someone whom, for reasons well beyond this discussion, the current Turkish regime has tried to destroy. But that first book I wrote about him is about his thinking and how it relates to a whole range of individuals, from Socrates to Einstein. But my primary emphasis is on how his thinking relates to Rumi. So in the context of that book, I also present a much briefer kind of introduction to to mysticism, and then to Sufism, and then to Rumi, as part of the lead up to my discussion of Gulen and his intellectual and, I would say, psychological and emotional relationship to Rumi. If that answers your question.
Yeah, it really does. And personally, I want to share something about that. And I only want to share this because I know it's an experience of so many kids that have experienced the regime that you just mentioned.
Yes.
I've seen a lot of kids and myself too, a lot of the youth go towards like more so Sufism rather than the traditional Islamic ways, because there's a lot of judgment, there's a lot of, things that we just talked about that push people away from religion. But if it's still in your heart, like Rumi mentions, like you said, he doesn't have to mention Islam because he knows in his heart that he has a connection with Allah. So religion is like just out of it, and I think that that's really important, and a lot of kids just like lean towards that because you find more love within than on the outside.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to sort of come full circle to where we began this evening, one's embrace of the world does not in any way, shape, or form threaten one's embrace of the particularities of oneself and one's particular form of faith. Those are not mutual contradictions because of what the nature of faith, the nature of religion, which is that it's beyond 2 + 2 = 4. In the realm of faith, 2 + 2 can equal 5. In the realm of faith, look, Jews and Muslims look at Christianity traditionally over history and say, how can you talk about a triune God? That's a contradiction. And in everyday rational terms, of course it is. 3 is 3, 1 is 1. You can't be both. But you can where God is concerned, because God doesn't conform to time, space, the way you and I do in our reality. So as a Christian, I can believe in a God that is simultaneously 1 and 3, and there's no contradiction there.
Yeah. And do you have a message for the youth? I know you shared a lot of different messages, which I loved all of them personally. Do you have another message that you would like to share before we end to the youth?
Yes. As long as you ask, yes. Do what you can to help improve the world around you. That's the one thing that I think we have as an obligation, repairing the world. It's clearly a world in dire need of repair. And at the same time, don't get discouraged that you can't. There is a rabbinic turn of phrase from the 1st or 2nd century, which says, the day is short, the work is large. The master, meaning Allah, is insistent. It's not incumbent upon you to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. So we can't get discouraged that we cannot alone fix it, but neither therefore say, well, I can't do anything about it anyway. And whether that means voting, right? Or whether that means picking up the trash, whatever it is, there are a zillion different ways in which everyone can be part of improving the world. And, you know, each generation wants to do its part. So that's it. That's my sermon.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. We really appreciate having you here today. And if you guys would like to be a part of our project, reach out to us. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Reyhan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.